Very good. Hello, my name is Katja Rieger. I'm the CEO of Levielle, and I'm here to talk with Genevieve, Levielle, and Colin about diversity in business. But first of all, let me introduce Genevieve. So Genevieve is from Haiti. What drives her, she told me, is food and travel. And believe me, she travels extensively. She's just been to a Burmese restaurant in Macau. She lived and worked from Haiti to New York, from California to London and the Channel Islands. So she is an islander, but one who craves the city. And her passion is demystifying technology to make it accessible to all. And I'm speaking with Colin Church. Colin is the opposite of an Englishman in New York. He is an American who moved to the UK in the 80s. His passion is history, in particular medieval English history, and to balance the probably more sedate passion, he's pretty crazy about sports as well. He did start this polo, which I find uniquely cool, because horses and sticks and balls, I just find it very challenging. But now he plays tennis 3 times a week, and he's training for a marathon in New York. And he is the CRO of Citi. And with that, I'm handing over my first question, and we'll start with Genevieve. So, Genevieve, what do you think about diversity in the business world?
Diversity is something that in the business world that we're really trying very hard, and I believe for the last 20 years we've been trying to get to. As a woman, I have been privy, or let's say lucky, to be one of those people that they have been attempt or real effort from my organization to support me in diversity. But it's not only about women, but also others, people from different walks of life or different way of being. But I think that we still have a long way to go. So I'm very happy to participate in this kind of opportunity, because if we can't solve the riddle, we continue to not be able to do well in financially as business, because it has been shown that most diverse business do better on average.
Very well. And Colin, what do you think about diversity in business?
You know, I too have been following the issue of 40 years of my career, starting in Wall Street, where diversity wasn't very significant at the time. There's certainly been a lot of progress in this industry, but you know, we all at senior management are spending a lot of time focusing on these issues. You know, we're very conscious diversity varies by industry, and it's very much of a handicap for those that haven't embraced it. I will say this, this time it really starts to feel different, the public focus on this, the metrics, although there's a reasonable amount of confusion on that, I don't think it goes back into the box. I think all of our organizations are now really getting very focused on metricable, tangible progress. Over the last decade, there's been a lot of well-intended effort, and people have tried many things that it's not necessarily yielded the results we would have wanted. But again, I think at this stage, there's external pressures, but that's not the driver, and I think it was just mentioned. The driver is it's not right. It's not a good business model. We're missing significant elements of the talent pool if people aren't feeling engaged and motivated 100% throughout the organization. So there's many reasons, and there, as much commercial as any other reasons that, we're all very focused on these issues.
Oh, very good. And before I continue with the questions, may I invite the audience to please ask their questions in the Q&A tab, because we will then look at the questions throughout that discussion and adapt our discussion to your interest and to the questions you are asking us. So please, audience, feel free to just ask us any questions. The more challenging, the better. But now back to the questions, and we have the advantage of having a CEO of a startup, somebody who works internationally very much with technology, and we have the CRO of a large corporation. Now, just from the first impression, that couldn't be a more diverse picture, would it? So maybe, Colin, why don't you start this time? What do you see to be the difference between a startup culture and the corporate world regarding diversity?
Well, I think there's strengths and weaknesses and flexibilities of both models. Clearly, large corporations are perceived to be more rigid, less agile, and that's probably true, and more likely to be, have the senior ranks stacked with old white men. That said, there's also challenges, I think, in smaller organizations as well, and there's also benefits. So one of the benefits of a large organization, you'll have the infrastructure to develop a program, to get in outside speakers and really focus on cultural changes. And then also, I think also very importantly, if you succeed, you're influencing a much larger cohort. So there's more to hunt for. I think it's easier to be more agile, as I said, in smaller organizations, but oftentimes my experience in the small organization equivalent in our organization would be hedge funds and small asset managers, who again can be financially very influential. And those tend to be very personality driven. So, I've seen experiences both sides on that where, run by extremely enlightened people who are very inspirational in this respect and set examples across the industry. And I think, a number of, some of these are personal friends who are very well known, people in the industry who've driven that. On the other hand, some of these are, the personality's not so enlightened, and it's a different issue. So I'd say there's not a generic answer that's one better. It's different as to how they work and what the opportunities are here.
Thank you, Colin. Genevieve, what do you think? What is the biggest difference between startup culture and corporate world?
So I very much agree with a lot of the points that Colin has brought in. And one that I'd like to add is when you're a small organization, you tend to hire people who work, talk, and look like you, which means when I look at technology, one of the challenges is that those teams are coming in and they're hiring people with or starting those teams with individuals who've had the same experiences as they have. And that is something actually which I think is rather problematic in that what they are creating, therefore, may be very biased to their own reality or experiences. Having worked in large organizations and some of the largest ones, such as Hewlett-Packard and GE, and also RBS, I absolutely agree that being able to have a talent pool which is global or different does help. But at times also we do not, and I think that's why it hasn't clicked completely, is that we don't really look at forcing people to mix together. Yes, they're there, but they're not having to interact always in the right level. So the problems with the startup for me is that usually you have a fear of losing the resources, which is something which is not as big of an issue in corporate world. So balancing those, and finally, I think even more, making sure that what is built, because there's been a few examples with very large corporation building solutions which were not inclusive in it. And that's something we need to safeguard.
Okay, let me stay here on that this aspect a little bit longer. Colin, you said something, you've seen very enlightened people, so individuals higher up, I suppose, who are able to influence, who were able to impact change, while you implied that probably some others were not quite as enlightened. And in a smaller space, you could feel their impact on the culture a lot. And now thinking about some of the more well-known startups, or by now probably not startups anymore, I've realized that there are sometimes CEOs or groups of people in the leadership who are very conscious about the culture they want to have. Now, let me ask you again, Colin, what do you think, how important is it to have such a person on the top who really has the values and is the enlightened person you've mentioned to drive diversity?
I'd say it's really critical. Many CEOs and certainly the outside world would define a key element of the CEO job is defining that culture, and it's not a compliance manual. It's not prescriptive activity. It's a frame of thought. It's what everybody comes into work in the morning and does. And I think one of the questions that we're discussing this is what influences this, and if you have it coming from the HR department or from below, or in corporate training, PC programs, and you're not hearing a reinforcement at the top, it's almost a negative, right? You wonder why that's not aligned, right? If it's driven from the top, and ultimately people are most attentive to the actions of the leader, right? And in tough decisions, they make those decisions. The rest aligns very naturally without the rest of it, although I think it is useful. I mean, one of the biggest things in sort of modern risk management is how do you set up a framework for managing conduct and, in effect, culture. And I think the regulators, and this is very big in the financial industry, the regulators have been pretty enlightened about this. They appreciate, yes, you have to have the disciplines and measurable aspects of this and policies, et cetera. But it's all hollow unless the most senior people in the organization are driving that process and feel accountable. So I think that's the critical question. That's where it comes from.
Thank you, Colin. And before I ask Genevieve for her opinion, I'd like to read first question which we've received from Theo. Theo Pulai, I hope I pronounced it correctly. He works at a recruitment company, in particular having the risk and quantitative analytics desk, and he feels that, I'm just reading it as he writes it, we have a responsibility for diversity within the investment banking sector. I have hosted diversity breakfasts before. However, we are finding women in the risk world are hard to come by, especially within roles in a quantitative nature. I have a few ideas on how to introduce women into the sector, but was wondering, with you, Colin, being a CRO at a top-tier investment bank, first, what is Citi doing about diversity and risk? And second, would you be interested in being a guest speaker at his next diversity breakfast? Today's fun. What are you doing?
Well, I'm glad I've so impressed him already that he wants me to speak. But we focus on it a lot. There have been some articles out there saying that the risk business is tougher for women, right? I guess in our experience, and it varies from firm to firm and culture to culture and microclimate within the banks as well. So again, when I say I inherited I guess lucky, here a reasonable balance of, after a series of very large mergers, the banking side of it and the corporate banking side and the traditional credit side was very well balanced, and some of our best, actually a majority of our best people were in fact women in this area, and that was one of the most influential areas of the issue. Other areas that have had a history of being highly analytical, right, from the cohort point of view, I'd say industry-wise, have been more men-oriented, right? We've spent a lot of time trying to figure it out, but digging up 20 years of history here is probably not as productive as just making sure we have a balanced development program going forward. And what we do a whole bunch of things. We have a specific program we call Women in Risk, where we pull out the top performing women and they meet the CEO and the most senior people of the firm and get as much exposure. And we think that's really key to the process, is getting access and visibility. Frankly, any of our seniors. So that's proven to be very successful, and we've kept that going for half a decade. And then they become the core of a network of bringing more people. We have a variety of programs here where we'll bring out all the women, literally, all the women at risk, and set up a network and have a specific program of speakers, again, to get them, more exposure, more engaged, and more networked than they would have been naturally. The other one we'll do is in all our processes, we're very conscious of retention, promotion, and recruitment, and very formally metricing those, right? And we'll look at as cohorts, so we'll, progress and mature, that we at least maintain, and it starts in a very valuable place historically and age-wise, and if not, progress those as well. So a variety of programs, and we continue to try more things and look for ideas from people. And again, this is around, really the driver here is having the best possible talent we can get our hands on, and we think we get a competitive edge, a notable, if we're recruiting from 100% of the population rather than a smaller segment of it.
Thank you, Colin. With regards to the previous question on having a person on the top being important to drive diversity, I recall, Genevieve, that the two of us had a discussion, and we were agreeing that a bottom-up approach could be working as well occasionally. Can you give us some examples or share your ideas in that respect?
So I think that it's great to have someone at the top be accountable and responsible for driving the diversity and making sure that the expenses which are associated with that are also in place. But I think that it's very important to have it also from the bottom for everyone to realize how not only is it affecting them and their work, but also be champion toward that. And my example toward this is that it's really about starting very early in people's career in getting them to acknowledge the necessary to that and understand what it drives. Because I'm more in the technology arena, and it was technology in finance before, and not understanding how individuals, how you design. So one of the key things that's happening in banking is we all looking at digital banking and the digital wallets. Well, it's been found that many of the decisions for the day-to-day spending are actually being done by women. So it's important that we design in a way that takes into account what is necessary for them. And so we need to make sure that those who are at the start of their career also understand the value.
Okay, so indeed, diversity starts early on, because otherwise you're not going to have a pipeline later. And it starts early on because it is part of your customer base. So one of the reasons why we have to think more about diversity is the customer base. But let me ask you, is there a risk or is there a downside of diversity as well? And I just want to cite some research here where the most diverse teams and very evenly, very similar teams have been compared in their performance. And the interesting piece in that research was that the most diverse teams were either performing absolutely worst or absolutely best. And the more even or similar teams were performing quite good occasionally. So why do you think that is, and what do you think is the downside of diversity, or can be the downside? Genevieve, why don't you start?
I think it's that fear of the unknown and the conflict. And I wonder, though, does that have to do, has the research also shown, are those teams in the same co-location? What's the touch point that they have with one another? Because I do find that nowadays because we rely on technology such as the phone or video to actually conduct business, a lot of time what will be diverse teams will be dispersed teams. And they don't get to see each other, which means you don't get to do that reach out and touch someone or see or try to resolve those conflicts very quickly on a one-to-one space. I have experienced myself both working with a team which is right next to me versus remotely, and it takes longer, which means that could also be affecting the performance.
Interesting. And just to answer your question, Genevieve, that was a lab experiment, so of course the people were together. But I think you were already implying a couple of the reasons why diversity works or doesn't work, and that has to do with the ability to solve conflict and to touch each other in whichever way. What do you think, Colin, is the reason why diversity, or what could be a downside of diversity?
Yeah, that's a trick question, I guess, because again, in what I do, that's not an intuitive conclusion. Where balance in a diversity of thought is actually is really quite critical. I guess the opposite of that would be groupthink, which in commonality in certain specific tasks, and I guess you were just telling us there might be seen as an advantage. Our experience in the business we do, it's really hard to see where that really would be an advantage. So I'd sort of challenge the premise almost on.
Okay, so there is no downside to diversity?
That's how I would answer that, yes.
And of course, like nowadays, most of us would be in agreement there. But let's then move to the question, so what do you think is needed to manage diversity? What kind of skills do we need so we can benefit from diversity? Colin, please.
So yeah, I'll take a shot at it. Yeah, I'd say a couple of things from our experience and things that have worked and recent things that have worked here. One is and we were discussing it earlier. The clear cultural framework and a tone from the top and behaviors from the top is obviously helpful, right? If people are getting mixed messages or it's still done on a siloed basis, it's hard to get everybody along. I think training works. This can be done well. It can be done in a way that may not be helpfully reinforcing. One of the ones they've had, our CEO has had all our senior management doing, and we continue to roll out in some pretty upmarket and not cheap unconscious bias training. And this is about diversity in every respect. Gender obviously being a notable one. And I've been in some of these exercises, and for all of us who think we're pretty good at this, and when they have real life actors casting real life situations, and I think when people see that, it can be very powerful. Even today, where you're probably in the top end of enlightenment, if you will, that types of things, and then consistent training and interaction more generally. And it's gender's an important part of it, but it's much more broader than that, and it's really about inclusion at all levels, and that can be male to male, but it's the tone of a culture and how one's trained to interact and how one's trained to really get the most out of people, get the most engagement, the most enthusiasm. We're sitting here spending a lot of time about thinking about how we drive the most efficient organization possible, and technology is a big piece of it, but some of it's really not that complicated. If people are motivated, engaged, believe in what they do, like their leaders, like the people around them, like the culture they're part of, that makes a big difference. There's a 10 to 20% comfortable efficiency gain in that alone, as well as it makes a more pleasant place to work. So, there's a whole series of thoughts there, and I think the world's now beginning to develop a really pretty useful toolkit around bringing large numbers of people around to a common set of perceptions and assumptions around this.
So from the top, that goes together with the enlightened leader, the unconscious bias training, seeing real-life scenarios or acted out through actors, and getting, frankly, what you said about getting engagement, motivation, and creating a good culture where people are happy to work. That sounds like leadership to me, plain and simple. So you're right, it's not that complicated. But let's give that question to Genevieve, because Genevieve, you already started, like conflict solving abilities was one, but I'm sure there are more, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think that Colin's industry has as an advantage is the regulatory aspects of the industry, which is not in evidence. So if we look at some of the scandals of last year around bad behavior at companies such as Uber, whereby there was a need to really shake not only the organization, but also those who were sitting on the board of the organization. And I wonder, how do we get that aspect of inclusion and changing unconscious biases and getting that cultural framework? So I think the cultural framework is really important, because we're no longer just bound to all the borders of our country or sovereign nations. So we do need to be conscious about others, but how do we bring in that discipline, I think, is part of the challenge, because we are still in a language which is about the bias is usually around gender or color or maybe sexual orientation. But we do need to, and so when that unconscious bias comes into play, it's really beyond those which are assumption about how a different culture behaves and things that may not be, we don't understand clearly. So I think that given that, and I'm sorry to say, Colin, that the technology companies are now becoming the new titan of industry, how do we get them to really get into that cultural framework aspects? And I think that's the challenge that we have still.
I'm hearing from Colin that it's about leadership, and now I'm hearing from you, Genevieve. You mentioned it very quickly before you called it a cultural framework, but it's about ethical leadership, right? I mean, like misbehaving is something which we can't accept anymore, and diversity is just part of behaving well. Did I understand you right there, Genevieve?
Oh, definitely. So if you take a look at what happened with some of the big companies in the Bay last year, these were both in terms of the lack of cultural framework on how people would behave on the gender level. It was also at the level of the leaders not behaving. But I think because a lot of these leaders get very lucky with an idea, become very rich, does that mean that they're all capable or trained to be in that role? So what happens, however, though, the financial industry has always been regulated. So it's not only what you do as an organization, it's what the government can do to you, has always made it to where there are processes which are very well defined. But I'm finding that in the startup world, there isn't that. There isn't that framework, even though we do try to through leadership program to instill that. But at the end of the day, you have very small teams who are trying to get to the promised land, as they say, and forget those cultural biases. And today, you don't work with only the people in your country. You have to work with maybe 4 or 5 different locations. And we don't always have an understanding of what drives them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the financial services industry has been regulated, but it had its own share of scandals. So from a CRO perspective, Colin, would you equate the need for diversity with a general need for ethical behavior? I mean, like you mentioned conduct before.
And again, that's a good question, but I think, again, people would tie those in as being pretty correlated. And I think one of the challenges for the regulators, and I was invited, this was probably a half a decade ago, when the Financial Stability Board, which coordinates all the regulatory activity and, kind of post-crisis response of the world in a way, was very much trying to get their head around conduct and, in effect, how do you encourage conduct behavioral outcomes, right? Because that was seen as one of the biggest issues. The industry itself had a strong self-interest here. There was over $200 billion in fines and problems that occurred very directly on this front. So that very quickly became which dwarfs anything anybody lost over that period of time in credit or market risk or the traditional risk. So very much focus on it. But again, it's, we tend to be very good at quantitative things that require very specific technical outcomes. How you motivate large behavior, how you measure it, et cetera, is one of the challenges. And really notable. And it's continued, I was on another thing. I said, around operational risk in this respect, it when you see it, but the world needs more than that if you're going to scale it. So there have been a lot of creative thoughts as to how you would put pressures on governance bodies, how you would, demand accountability. You've seen some of the things in the UK regime of really very much, the SMR regime, et cetera, been developed along those lines to encourage behavioral outcomes. And again, I would say diversity, I won't preempt my punchline here today, but diversity of thought, and that comes from gender, that comes from culture, that comes from backgrounds and experience and stuff, is absolutely essential to get these things right. Because, I've seen it happen in many places. It's where you get a groupthink or a pocket of people who are unaware of the world they're interacting in or how that world has moved on, right? And that becomes a very dangerous risk to an enterprise. And you were mentioning technology. Some of the largest ones on Earth, potentially, existential crisis in this space, and now it's being played out in technology. Maybe people got bored of banking after a while. But these are very real issues. If the most, some of the most significant leaders of, the largest enterprise in the world don't appear to get it, right? It usually ends in a bad way. And I think this is one indicator in a suite of issues, right? In that, but I do think they're pretty correlated. And it's a pretty good indicator if people are getting these types of issues wrong. They may well be at risk elsewhere in terms of, almost say it's sort of xenophobia, not having, it's common sense if you understand the world you're working in, right? And there's enough practical incentives, irrespective of, particular individuals or leaders, true morality in this, to behave right. It's when people lose that perspective of, the broader constituencies they're working for. As well, it's a bad commercial model, right? It also, that type of intense groupthink and unawareness puts the whole organization and these individuals at risk. So that's
okay.
how I look at it. Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. And we've now talked about the risk which a lack of diversity would bring us. Let's talk about the upside. And here I have an excellent question, or actually some data here from the audience. Rostum Barucha has asked that city average for diversity is around 18%. Research shows that companies who have increased this to 33% have increased profitability by 66%. Also, a big U.S. investment bank in the UK took 52 new grads this year. All of them were women. And Rostum loves to hear what the panel thinks of this. Who wants to start? Genevieve?
I think it's amazing. Now, what I think will be very important is to keep them in those roles, so I don't want to be negative, but I'll be very interested to see what that company will do to maintain, because I think that it's one thing to sort of speak to diversity by bringing the people in, but we also need to make sure that the environment is conducive to them staying. One of the key failing for women of at the young age at the start of their career happens to be how do they manage having a family and being able to have a family and continue in their job. I think that some organizations have done a very good, come with very good decision and mechanism to enable that. But having been in banking previously, I didn't find that it was very conducive to fostering this, because a lot of time you need to be in the office to be functional, and it doesn't take into account that you may have concerns with your support mechanism at home. So I'd like to throw it back to say it's amazing, but I think we need to do more than just actually hire, but actually create the environment.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And let's ask Colin what he thinks about it and what Citi is doing about creating this environment.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of statistics out there all of a sudden, and it's been mandated, and there's a lot of confusion about it, but in a way that's very constructive in the way it draws a lot of attention to the issue. So one of the issues when you see these, now they've been mandated in the UK, gap exposures, what that really reflects is a lack of seniority in these organizations, right? And rather than necessarily the gap in same pay for same jobs, right? There's undoubtedly something there as well, but it's not clear in the morass. It's great to see people being very self-conscious publicly, setting specific targets of where they would intend to take their organizations. I'd very much share Genevieve's view is that not so much about, the intake's important, but we actually do pretty well on that. The real key and a challenge for us, and I was going to say at Citi, one of the things we focus on at risk is how do you get those people through all the stages? And it's really those last couple of jumps historically of the ones where, you lose the key people. And I think it is just that simple, is being thoughtful and flexible and having a culture that's open to this as well around flexibilities of the family life cycle, as you put there, and also one being a little bit strategic around how you help people with their careers around this. Because one of the things I mentioned, this Women in Risk program that we'd sort of set up, that came up when we were looking at a number of really deserving people we wanted to promote. But it was clear they were so far along in their career that they hadn't had an opportunity to develop a diversity of experiences. So it was very tough to do that without really forcing it. So one of the thoughts is very much is to manage a life cycle of people's careers where you're making sure they've had enough jobs and skills so that they can, get those top couple of rungs when they get there. So I think that's absolutely the issue that, is probably the most challenging historically, and also the one that's the most important to progress, is to how do you, not just recruit at that level, which is pretty easy to do, but be sure that you maintain that cohort throughout the process and, to the, the highest levels of the ladder.
Maybe I can add one aspect to it, because I'm a single mom myself and I've had a very interesting career. And I am totally with Genevieve that the lack of support is a major factor, juggling family or kids and career. But frankly, having talked to a lot of people, women at my level of career, there was one thought which was even more overwhelming to a lot of women stepping out of their very high flying careers, and that is the politics at work. And this was the, going back to what actually Colin had said before as well, it was not a motivating environment to work at. You had to do more stuff in defending yourself or in playing games than actually working. So somehow this is a factor which is even harder to tackle than creating more flexible work models. Genevieve, you were laughing. Maybe you want to answer that?
No. I just was laughing about that because I think the politics is even more than just the back and forth, but even spending time of having to project a certain look is something which is difficult. And if you are tough as nail, that can be very seen and talked of negatively. While if you're, so it's those cultural things that we need to shift in ways to to allow young women to feel empowered to sort of be vocal. And we tend to, I still find that we still want women or certain aspect of a society to be in a certain role. And when they don't fit that mold, then it is a negative against them. And that's why I laugh. Sorry.
No. I mean, I like your laugh because it sounded like you could sympathize. You know what? It's a fascinating discussion. And sorry, and I don't want to cut it short. I still have another question from Jean Bernard. I can't see the surname here. Jean Bernard is saying one characteristic of diversity is the multiplicity of values, whether religious or cultural based. And most companies have a set of explicit values, which may be felt as strange when seen from certain parts of the world. Respect of deadlines, corruption, etc. How do you identify gaps and work to reduce them to ensure company values are respected? Colin, maybe you start there, and then I hand over to Genevieve.
Well, in fact, maybe it's a little easier at CitiBank because we do business in 100 countries, right? Pretty actively, and from a different country background, in addition, to the gender issues, we start off with a very diverse populace, right? It's critically important, and I think it was mentioned earlier in the call. Those are our clients as well, right? So we need to be them. We need to look like them. We need to be able to relate. There's common values that I think really do. This isn't that tough. Again, I'll come back. That cut across all cultures on this. And yes, there'll be certain regions of the world where the local thoughts will be different, notably, and that, in theory, could create some tension. But, I think, it's pretty clear that as we work in those countries, if you go to the foreign bank who has this sort of international ethic, if you will, that's what people want to join, and that allows us to recruit some of the most talented people in these countries because they're not afforded those benefits elsewhere. We can offer these people careers well outside that country, which, again, allows us to lever ourselves in a way we hadn't. And I think the deal is our function in these countries is that of connecting to the outside world. So I think there's an acceptance that we're going to have a slightly different ethic, certainly around in countries where they're not, necessarily gender favorable. We'll employ a lot of women because they're just the most talented people who are not really getting that opportunity. We're not the only company who thinks that way, and there's many others who do that, and it's a positive catalyst. So I think at a level it hasn't proved overly challenging where we run into those distinctions, and again I think we have been able to bring a common culture, but and again that culture, that aspirational culture, if you will, is not particularly I think is pretty common to a lot of similar organizations who have been doing business in a variety of countries for a long period of time, and being good at this, being balanced, making sure, as we say, from an engagement motivation point of view, all employees feel they've got a fair shot at it if they're willing to make the commitment to get there. Is critical to the success of the organization. The minute you lose that, it's a very different place, and it's going to be very hard to win the game.
Thank you, Colin. That sounds very encouraging. Genevieve, I know you work across multiple time zones and cultures. What's your take on that?
I have been lucky to live in many places, and I actually make it one of my goals to make sure that my team also gets that diversity. I happen to have a very diverse team, but they have their own cultural bias themselves, and it's important to sort of help them debunk what their assumption or their cultural biases may be, and it takes time to work through that. And that's the only way you can be successful. Looking at, having worked in corporate world where it's acceptable that you're working 9 to 5 or maybe 8 till 7 sometimes, but you have your free weekends. And now you're working in a startup where you don't have that luxury, and the individual in another part of the world is one waiting for you. And being able to understand what their challenges are. It could be that they don't have good internet at home and they have to go to work to do that. And being able to get the team to function that way is really something that I think is important. And what I would probably like to ask is companies such as Citi should be taking the time to really work with some of those startups, because mostly in London we have hundreds of them coming out, and maybe 2 or 3 will be very successful. But if we don't get them starting with that cultural framework and really thinking about how to bridge these gaps, we are going to continue to not reach our goal of diversity. So it's an opportunity.
Thank you. And with that, even so, we still have interesting questions, but we're running over time. So maybe, Colin, you start with a short finishing statement. Ideally, an action-oriented one. What can we all do to increase diversity for our all benefit?
Well, I think you've got to, one is a sort of a statement on why it's so important in, kind of my role, and then 2, kind of what you, how you go about it. One of the things is, as I travel into, a lot of our branch offices, and people ask us about how we've dodged some of the biggest bullets, flying around in the last half decade or decade, particularly in the geopolitical area. I put a lot on this is diversity of thought. We're always looking to try and get, and me personally, the dissenter in the room, somebody with a different experience, somebody with a different perspective, and then listen a bit, right? You may not always go with that, but you want to hear that. If you go with groupthink, the biggest accidents in our industry, and we're now starting to talk about others, in this area, really all seem to go back to that fact pattern. So, irrespective of the multiplicity of other key reasons, most notably having the best access to a talent pool and having that talent highly motivated, which are about as fundamental as it gets. The ability to make the right strategic decisions, the right risk decisions, are very much linked to this. In terms of kind of action plans, how you go about it, I think everybody has to make it personal, all right, and live it in your, daily life. The groups you're responsible for managing, set the example, encourage it. When you see it drifting from a bias point of view, get your finger out and get back on the scale to get it back into a balanced point of view. And then I think, again, as we're discussing, remaining open, listening a lot, soundings to what people are telling you, and creating an environment where people are inclined to tell you. And, and again, this speaks to gender, but there's many other, we were discussing it, correlated issues of substance that tie into that kind of a culture and approach. And again, I'd encourage that. For everybody to start there, and to the degree, I think also the other one, and a lot of things in life, humility. You may think you understand this, particularly as a male, all right? Assume you're missing things, and establish a network to fill in those spaces, as you were saying, and be sure you're open to getting ongoing live criticism of where you may not be getting it right. And I think those things have helped me in my job. I think they help others.
Thank you, Colin. That's beautiful. Genevieve, what's yours?
I can't be as beautiful as Colin because that really inspired me. I think that it's continue to move the needle. I think that we must not get complacent and think that we've reached it, because as soon as we believe we have, we will turn around and find out that actually we're very far away from the goal. So it's a goalpost that continues to, and part of that has to do with human nature. Part of we have to realize that inclusion also generates fears of unknown. So when you talked about those teams which were not successful, it's because trust. So really, it's about how do we get individuals to build trust with one another, and then become effective. And then we have to also trust that we will never get to the ultimate, because the emotion of individual will always come in the way. And as we're moving to a society where more and more we're working with individuals who are very far from us, we need to, as organization, put in the cost factor to get those individuals in the same room together. Because it doesn't need to be every day, but if they get to know one another as individuals, then they can be much more successful, which then translates for the organization into financial success and longevity.
Wow, humility and trust, two very big things to get us to the diversity we need. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your patience. We ran over time. I was just too engrossed in the discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and I hope to hear from all of you back, maybe through comments and questions. With that, I hand over to Charlie.
Thanks everyone for joining this risk webinar. You can catch up with more webinars, interviews, e-magazines and session recordings with Risk Minds 365, and join us at our upcoming events. The next one will be Risk Americas in Boston. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.